Hello, biologists. Welcome to lecture. Today we're going to talk about the mechanisms for evolution and why Charles Darwin is involved. So first we're going to introduce Charles Darwin, and then we're going to talk about his inspiration for his idea and the evidence we have to support it. Charles Darwin wasn't the only person to come up with his big idea. There was another guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, and both of them independently came up with the idea of natural selection as the force behind evolution. Now, evolution is the idea that things change over time. And then a mechanism for evolution is something that allows it to occur. Natural selection is the thing that allows evolution to occur. What is natural selection? Natural selection is the idea that some organisms are better suited for their environment. And then if they're better suited for their environment, they can survive and reproduce. And the whole goal is to pass on your genes to the next generation. Remember, natural selection is sometimes described as survival of the fittest, and fitness in biology refers to your ability to pass on your genes. So who is fittest in the environment isn't who's biggest or strongest or like the fastest. It's who's able to successfully reproduce. And each individual will have a different advantage based on random mutations that they get from sexual reproduction. So every individual is different than their parents and different than their siblings. And some of those individuals will be better suited. That's natural selection. It's called natural selection because the environment where the thing lives, whether or not it's in the desert or the jungle or in like a tide pool, that environment selects who is better suited to reproduce. So both of these two men came up with their ideas. They knew each other. Darwin was a society man. He's well off. He's established. He's older. He's respected. Alfred Russel Wallace, he was writing to Darwin, telling him about his ideas. Darwin had had those ideas previously, but had not published anything about it. And so knowing that Alfred Russel Wallace was going to publish his own work kind of pushed Darwin forward to get his work written and published. And so they presented together in 1858 at the Linnaean Society, and they both discussed natural selection. So they're both credited for the idea. But Darwin's name is heard more often because the next year he published his book on the origin of the species. And that book was like a big deal. Like it was a huge deal. It was either loved or hated, depending who you were. And everyone was talking about it. And so Darwin gets some of the lasting legacy that Alfred Russel Wallace does not, for that reason and for the reason that he was already established and well known and like a rich guy that people respected. So what is the idea? On the origin of the species that Darwin published, if you haven't tried to read it before, I recommend you try it and get ready for like a difficult struggle. It's super verbose. The first sentence alone is like almost a whole page long, but it's a really interesting book. And we know that making ourselves struggle through hard reading is good for us. It's called Cognitive Endurance. So please give it a go. In his book, he came up with two parts that helped support our idea of evolution and how it works. One is that organisms are alive, all descended from an ancestor. So in effect, we are all related, all of us, everything, birds, rats, humans, we're all related. And that idea was not well received. The idea that all people are related and all animals are related really messed with the hierarchy that colonialization had set up. And the second part of the idea is that natural selection is the force behind evolution. And Darwin didn't use the word evolution, he used the term descent with modification. His colleagues, they would call evolution transmutation, so like change over time. The word evolution wasn't super popular yet. So he describes descent with modification. You are descending from your parents with a different set of alleles. You've been modified. So what did Darwin do? Darwin went on this voyage from 1831 to 1836. That's a really long time to be on a boat, and even a longer time to be on the boat if you get horribly seasick, which Darwin was horribly seasick for a lot of the time. In fact, whenever the boat went along the edge of a coast, he would try and travel on land and meet the boat at the next location because he hated being on the boat so much. His role on the boat was to be the assistant, like society assistant, gentleman assistant, emotional assistant, social entertainment to the captain. And so he really loved natural life, and he would collect specimens and talk about them and think about these big ideas in science. And he wasn't just a biologist, he was a zoologist, he was a geologist, he studied a little bit of everything. And so his goal was to be like the mental intrigue for the captain. So they started up in England and they traveled all the way around the world. And he, at each of these locations, was looking at different things. And we'll go through his observations that helped him come up with his idea of natural selection. One of the places that gets the most credit is the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, so Ecuador owns the Galapagos. They're right out in the Pacific. They're pretty far away from land, the mainland. And so they're isolated, and the organisms that live there are really different, yet similar to the organisms that live in mainland Ecuador. Here's a zoom in. So here's Ecuador, and here are the Galapagos Islands. If we zoom in on that even further, we can see the islands right here. Now, Darwin, he loved birds. And so while he was visiting these different islands, he took specimens of all the birds, which means he killed them and kept their bodies. He taxidermied them and he shipped them home. But he wasn't a bird expert himself. So when he got back to England, he sent his finch specimens to bird experts and then waited a couple of years while they collected the data and sent it back to him. And what he found was that all of these birds had modifications that were different than each other, but really suited to the environment that they're in. And so if you look at their beaks are different sizes and shapes. So here, right, these two little islands in the center of the Galapagos, these are the Daphnes. And the Daphnes are really important to evolutionary biology, not because of Darwin, but because of two contemporary scientists, Peter and Rosemary Grant. Peter and Rosemary Grant have been going to Daphne Major every single year for a long time. And what they do is, since it's a small island and no one is allowed there, they capture every single finch and they measure its body, they measure its beak, they note who it is, they note who it's breeding with, they talk about their offspring. So they track the entire population. Almost every once in a while, there's one bird they can't catch, of finches on this island for decades. And they have been able to see how environmental changes like droughts have affected the population of these finches over time. And this isn't just one couple's life of research. They have found that speciation occurs rapidly. Like, they watch new species evolve as they're collecting their data. It's fantastic. Darwin didn't know about genetics. Darwin didn't know how this all worked, but he had the inklings when he was there, and his information has been elaborated on by further scientific research. There's an incredible book about Peter and Rosemary's Grant. It's called The Beak of the Finch. This is the blurb from the back. Take a moment to read it. So this says they spent 20 years doing it. This book is from the 90s, maybe even the late 80s. So it has been double that now, and the data keeps supporting their ideas. They can absolutely track the population and see how it's changing over time related to what's going on in the environment. I read this book when I was in high school, and it was so exciting. I was like, oh man, one day I'm going to go to the Galapagos. And in 2023, I applied to a program through Stanford University, and I got to go to the Galapagos. So here's me on one of the boats. I'm in the Galapagos Islands. This is Daphne Major, where all the research has been done. This is Daphne Minor. You are not allowed to go there. This is me. And so we couldn't go visit this place where I've been reading about since I was a kid and really excited to see, but we got to see it from the distance. And the reason you can't go there is because they want to limit the human impact. So no one is allowed to go there at all unless you're actively doing research. And so these islands are extra special because they're like living laboratories. The control on them is so great that you limit your confounding variables. Really a fascinating place. I have to show you a couple more pictures because I was so excited to go to the Galapagos. Every single island is the result of a volcano. So they're pushing up from the ocean floor. And every single island has a population of Galapagos tortoise. And each tortoise has a different shaped shell based on the island that it lives on. Some of them have shells that are kind of flat behind their head. Some have an arc right here. They're called a saddleback. The ones that have an arc, their vegetation is higher. And so the tortoise has to lift its head higher up, and the shell has modified to accommodate that. These Galapagos tortoises are incredible. That one's maybe 150 to 200 years old. We're not totally sure how long they live because we haven't been studying them that long. We do know that some that Darwin collected are still alive. Like they have incredibly long lifespans. We do have an incredible story of one called Lonesome George. He was the last of his species, the last type of tortoise from his island. And there was a major attempt to try and get him to find a mate so that his species didn't go extinct. It didn't work. He went extinct in like 2012. But if you ever go to the Galapagos Islands, at the Galapagos Islands, in the Charles Darwin Research Center, they have Lonesome George taxidermied, and you can go visit the last of the species. It's really powerful to see something like that in person. Here's some of the people that I went with. The Stanford program was for biology teachers who teach evolution at the college level. So these are all other biology teachers who teach evolution. And we went to the Galapagos Islands to go see the inspiration and then to talk about how best to educate our students about the process of evolution. And we just had so much fun. So I highly recommend Googling anything that you're interested in, trying to find scholarships or programs about it, and applying to it because you never know what exists. I didn't know this program exists until I was looking into how can I possibly get to the Galapagos Islands. Going back to Darwin, Darwin was a really interesting figure. He's very problematic, but he's also very commendable. So I want to lay out all of his good and bad so that we can continue to discuss him and not like pretend that he's just a perfect specimen of a research biologist. So Darwin was a vocal opponent to slavery. That's amazing. He advocated that all humans are related and that it is completely offensive to enslave another human because we are brothers and sisters. Absolutely true. In fact, his book on the origin of the species, it was banned in the Americas when it came out because that idea was so revolutionary that they were worried people would stop allowing slave owners to have slaves. And our society was built upon that. And Darwin hated the idea. He thought it was abhorrent. So great, commendable. He was unaware of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, it's also called meritocracy or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's this idea that you get what you work for in life. So if you are experiencing poverty, it's because you're not working hard enough. If you are not famous, it's because you're not trying hard enough. And we know that that's not accurate, that there are societal things, cultural things set into place that make it impossible or harder for people to change their lot in life. Social Darwinism is used as a way to write off people and keep them down. He didn't know that was a thing, so we don't get to give him a hard time for that. However, he was misogynistic. He did think that men and women were completely different and had different abilities. And his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, he helped found the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement is the idea that you can breed better humans. And that always is problematic because who decides what's better? And Darwin supported the idea because he believed in a racial hierarchy. So problematic for sure. So why do we talk about Darwin so much? And one of the reasons that we talk about Darwin over Alfred Russel Wallace is Darwin was really good at keeping notebooks and incredible at writing letters to his friends. And so we have a lot of Darwin's writings. We have a lot of quotes of his work. I have some fun quotes here for you. Take a moment to read them. So these are funny, but they also give us insights into Darwin. Darwin himself had really poor health. He did not feel good. He was bedbound. He had awful periods where he just could not manage to get anything done. Um, and so he was a rough character a lot of the time because of how poorly he felt. And he also got very frustrated when he couldn't understand things, which we all do. But he wrote about it a lot and it makes great quotes for us. So here, I hate a barnacle as no man ever did before. He has a paper on barnacles. He studied them for years. He dissected them. He drew pictures of their bodies. He spent hundreds and maybe thousands of hours thinking about them and then getting annoyed about not understanding them fully. Same thing for this peacock tail quote. He could not make sense to himself why a peacock tail was so elaborate because it makes it harder for them to fly. Like that doesn't make sense. Why would something that would limit your ability to live be selected for? And so he has all these strong feelings about being confused about it, but he writes lyrically and he writes really funny. So I have two more sets of quotes for you. I have one, his pro and con list about whether or not to get married, and his own feelings about one of the few photographs that we have of him. Go ahead and pause it if you need a little more time to read it all. He ultimately did decide to get married. He married Emma, who was his first cousin, and he had 10 kids. He used the health of his children to support his idea that marrying people you're related to causes inferior offspring. So of his 10 kids, 3 died in infancy. Many of them were sick like he was sick. And so overall, his family wasn't very healthy and was struggling to just get through like adulthood. Um, and so he never stopped thinking about what evolution could be doing and how it could be affected by descent of modification. So we're going to go through now and we're going to look at Darwin's inspirations that he either saw in his life or on his voyage on the Beagle. And we're going to talk about how those inspirations can help support to the idea of evolution. So the first thing that Darwin was really inspired by was homologies. We know that homologous structures are structures that are similar because these critters are closely related. So here we have pictures of the forelimbs of 2 different types of animals. One is a turtle and one is a dolphin. Now, a turtle and a dolphin, one's a mammal, one's a reptile, but they're still related in life. These are cousins in the evolutionary scale, these animals. And so in their forelimbs, you can see this pattern that we've discussed before of one humerus, radius and ulna, your carpals, your metacarpals, and your phalange. So even though they're used very differently in 2 different types of animals, that body plan has been conserved, and thus it's a homologous feature. Check out this quote from Darwin. Take a moment to read it. So he's musing about all of these different structures being similar in these creatures that are totally not similar. And as he goes, he's also really inspired by plate tectonics and geology. And this wasn't common knowledge at the time. Like we didn't really understand that whole continents moved. That was a big deal. And he has this quote about being scared of earthquakes while walking around. Go ahead and read it. If you need more time to read any of these quotes, please feel free to pause the video. I'm going to keep going so the video is not too long. So plate tectonics, we have plates that are shifting. Some are pushing up over others. Some are subducting under others. When that happens, it causes earthquakes, but also creates new land and destroys land that was already existed. We have plates where they're pulling apart, and where they pull apart, we have volcanic uplift. And so that creates this area of new land being formed, but also our volcanic islands. So those volcanoes are magma pushing up through the ocean, creating new land. We also have areas where the plates are coming together and causing uplift. That's how we got like the Rocky Mountains. So those plates push upward as they attach. All of this leading to instability in our physical environment. So if you looked at the Earth 50 million years ago, 100 million years ago, 500 million years ago, you would see these continents move and shift and pull apart and smush back together. And we still see the evidence. It's still happening today. And that constant change helps us with the idea of natural selection, because our Earth is not stable. It is constantly reworking itself. And the organisms that live on Earth have to be able to either change with it or die off. So here's another quote about the lava. I love the last line. They seemed like animals from another planet. It does feel like another planet in the Galapagos. So this is one of my pictures from, I believe this is Santiago Island here, and this is all new volcanic land. So I was standing on land that is completely new, and organisms had not moved into this new landscape yet. Whoever moves into this new landscape is going to help change it. It's going to break down that lava rock into little tiny particles. Those little tiny particles, with the dead bodies of the animals that move in and the plants that move in, will create soil. And that soil will eventually allow other organisms to move into it. This is a process that we're going to talk about later in the term. But here you can see where the volcanic lava stops, and you have the older land. This was all black lava at one point, but now it's been turning into actual dirt, and there's plants. And over here, there's all sorts of critters that live there. So this is a new piece of Earth that was recently created. And that's our evidence that Earth is constantly changing. Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite critters from the Galapagos, the marine iguanas. Please read this quote from Darwin. This is a marine iguana. They are the only marine reptile. They eat algae and seaweed in the ocean, and then they come up to the land and they bask in the sun because they are an ectotherm, and so they need to regulate their body with the outside environment. Darwin has a couple quotes about these that I love. Now, reptiles are not accustomed to salt water, and so marine iguanas have a system in their nasal cavity where they condense the salt, and then they shoot snot rockets of salt water out of their nose constantly to get the salt out of their body. So they really are incredibly adapted to their environment. A lizard that spends most of its time foraging in the ocean, shooting salt out of its nose, living on this lava rock on a volcanic island that's relatively new on Earth. Just a fantastic creature. Another thing that inspired Darwin was all of those finches. So all of those finches on the Galapagos is an example of adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation means there was a group of finches that were flying and got blown all the way out to the Galapagos, and they settled there. That's our theory. And I'm using theory colloquially. That's our idea. We don't really know what happened, but the finches got to the islands. And as that little population of finches stayed at the islands, they became specialized for their environments through natural selection. So here we have our original population of finches. Finches reproduce once a year. So as they reproduce, you have a generation every year. And over time, they branch off into different types of finches that have a different type of food source. So some of the finches have beaks that are adapted for eating seeds, and this is the name of the finches. The Geospiza is their genus, and then each of them has a different specific epithet. If you eat really hard seeds, you need a big, strong beak. If you eat slender seeds, you need a tiny, delicate beak. And then we also have finches that were adapted to eat bugs. So here you have pointy little beaks. Here you have thicker beaks. Each one of these beaks is a different length and depth and width. And then we also have beaks that were adapted to flower parts and beaks that are adapted to cactus. There's even one finch, the vampire finch. It will drink blood. And so it's got a sharp beak as well. And it doesn't drink blood all the time, but it does sometimes. So each of these is a descendant of the original population. And each of these has adapted to their environment via natural selection. So in the original population, there were mutations that led to thicker beaks or thinner beaks. And whoever had the beak that fit best was able to reproduce more offspring who looked like them, who were able to reproduce more offspring who looked like them. And over time, in a population, those alleles are overrepresented. So that population has more of that trait, it being a thicker beak or a thinner beak. So that's adaptive radiation, the example being the Galapagos finches. Darwin was also really inspired by fossils. Here's a quote for you. He's got such a way with writing, and that's one of the reasons that we still talk about him. This is a giant ground sloth fossil, and Darwin actually collected this fossil. It's on display, people can go see it. He dug it out himself and brought it aboard the ship and sailed around the world with it, and then was able to study it once he got back home. He loved fossils. And what was really inspiring about fossils is he saw sloths. Like he saw our current day sloths in person, and then he saw this giant ground sloth fossil, and he could see, because of his understanding of anatomy, that they were similar type animals, but that this one was massive and no longer existed. And so he's trying to piece together what could have happened over time to make the changes going from a huge ground sloth to the size of like, a small dog up in the treetops currently. Here's another one of his fossils that he loved. It's the giant armadillo. And so he's making all these connections of what used to exist and what currently exists. And as he's making these connections, he's making them from different locations. And so biogeography, which is the study of where organisms live, like physically where they live, was a big inspiration for him as well, because he saw organisms in the coast of South America fossil record that also existed in the coast of South Africa. And he didn't get to India or Antarctica, but he went to Australia and he saw similar fossils there too. If you take the continents and you cut them out, you can piece them back together as they used to fit. And that massive landmass is called Pangaea. And we have data suggest that there were organisms living right across the center of Pangaea, and where record of them is still there, even though the continents are no longer attached. And that was a really inspiring idea to him too, although it was mind-blowing at the time that continents could change position. Like we didn't have a full understanding of plate tectonics yet back in the day. He also found fossils that seemed to transition between different types of organisms. And that was a big deal for him too, because here's your giant ground sloth, here's your in-between, here's your current ground sloth. What could be causing the push to change over time? Natural selection. So here is a quote from Darwin. We have a really nice record of the transition into the horse. And so I have a video for you. I'll show you the image of it coming up. But from a tiny little dawn horse, this is our scale of evolution of the horse. Epoch is a measurement of time. So this is millions of years. From about 55 million years ago, there was a smaller organism. It had different types of foot bones. It had more than one toe, which most of us have. And over time, we find these different types of fossils. Here are the names of the fossils in different patterns. Each one of these that kind of splays off to the side is an evolutionary branch that died out. This is right about when we think they died out. And so this is a visual representation of a phylogenetic tree, but it's a phylogenetic tree that's being shown more like a river. So each section here that branches off, this is a node, this is a branch. These would be sister taxa. So we've oriented ourselves. And we can see over time from the ancient dawn horse from 55 million years ago with several different toes, over time, the horse kind of lost its weight-bearing toes until our current day horse, it only has one main toe that it puts weight on. And so we can see through the fossil record the evolution of the forelimb of our current horse. I'm going to take that idea and show you a video that relates to it. We're going to see the evolution of how a tetrapod went from land to water and how whales then reversed it and went back. Like they were a mammal and now they are an ocean mammal. So I'll put that video on Blackboard for you. It's really interesting. Another thing that Darwin had that really inspired him was artificial selection. So Darwin loved to keep pigeons, and pigeons were like the fancy thing to do back in the day. So he had a group of pigeons that he selectively bred to have different traits, much like people do with dogs, and much like people do with domesticated animals or domesticated plants, like breeding different types of peas or beans or tomatoes. Darwin did this with pigeons, and he has this great quote here. That idea really inspired him. He could see firsthand that he could change the outcomes of a species over time by controlling who reproduced and who didn't reproduce. That's essentially natural selection, but in this case, it was a human choosing who reproduced. So it's artificial selection. That's what we do when we breed things. Now, Darwin loved these pigeons. This is one of my favorite quotes of his. At one point, he had over 90 fancy birds, and he wrote to a friend, Lyle is his friend's last name, who was an inspiration for him. Lyle is a geologist. Please read that quote. Very proud of his pigeons. So we have all this evolution evidence, but do we get to see it in other organisms, or is it just the things that are extinct and just the things in the Galapagos? And so here's an example that we are all used to. It is dog domestication. So our current hypothesis of how dogs became domesticated is that sometime 33 to 15,000 years ago, the environment changed, and wolves that had a genetic variation that gave them a decreased flight distance were more successful. Flight distance is the distance you can get to an animal before it runs away from you. So I have two cats. Max is extremely cuddly. He has no flight distance. You can walk right up to him and pick him up. My other cat, Parker, he's very skittish. He has a high flight distance. He runs from us like 75% of the time when we go toward him. So that's flight distance. Here I have a domesticated dog, like a husky. It might not actually be a husky, but it's a husky-like dog. And then here is a wolf. So you can see the size and shape comparison between a domesticated dog and a wolf. So what if we set up settlements and some of the individuals that were around these human settlements were more likely to stay close? They had a lower flight distance. if the wolves had a lower flight distance, it would be an advantage to us as the humans because they could alert us to dangers and they could kind of protect us from other predators that might get into their area because wolves are territorial. The benefit to the wolf would be they're living around a human settlement, so we would protect them as well, but we could also throw them our scraps. Like we don't actively eat bones, but we'll eat everything off the bones. And so maybe they benefited from being around us. And over time, the individual wolves that were cooler, calmer, able to be closer to humans, benefited more from being near the humans. And that led to domestication. Domestication doesn't mean like I'm going to have you as a pet, like this husky here compared to this wolf here. Domestication in an animal is physiological changes. So in a domesticated animal, the ears change shape, the jaw changes shape, the teeth change shape, their fur pattern and texture changes, their overall head size changes. We're actually currently seeing this with raccoons. There's data to suggest that the raccoons that live in urban areas are becoming domesticated. Again, not pets, but that they are decreasing their snout size, they're decreasing their ear size, their ears are becoming more rounded in an adaptation to live in the human environment, not in people's houses and being cuddly, but to live around humans. That's what domestication is. So is there data for this hypothesis? And the answer is yes. There was an experiment. It's called the silver fox experiment. Now, it wasn't set up to understand dog domestication. It was actually set up because silver foxes were bred and used for their fur. And it turns out that foxes don't do well when they're bred for their fur because they're stressed. And when they're stressed, they don't reproduce. And if they don't reproduce, then you don't get the furs that you need to keep your business going. So back in the day in Russia, there was a fox breeding facility that was having trouble because all of their foxes refused to breed. And so they brought in a geneticist, and the geneticist started taking the foxes that had a lower flight distance and would breed those together. So if two foxes had a lower flight distance, they would be able to reproduce. That led to offspring with a lower flight distance. And that led to their own offspring having even lower flight distance over time. Within 30 generations of this selective breeding, where you're only allowing the more docile foxes to reproduce, the foxes had changed their behavior so that they sought human company. Their fur had changed color. They developed floppy ears, shorter legs, curled tails. They started to look like dogs. And so we thought that maybe dogs looked like they looked just randomly, but the way that dogs look might actually be a result of domestication. Further, we found that within 6 generations, that's just 6 years, a subset of fox would lick the hands of the experimenters, could be picked up and petted. They whined when humans left, and they wagged their tails when humans approached. Now, these are not wolves. We're not turning them into dogs. These are foxes. It's a different genus. By 15 generations, we could check their stress hormones, looking specifically for glucocorticoids, which is that same hormone that we talked about with rat licking. And those hormones were decreased by half. So they're physiologically and molecularly changing as we select for decreased flight distance. I have a video about it. The video's a little grainy because it's a little bit older, but it's got the actual footage of the silver fox facility, and I think that's worthwhile to see. So they're going to talk about the silver fox experiment, and you'll see some older footage. Really fascinating. I'll link to it for Blackboard for you. And then I want to take this opportunity to show you the scientific article that was produced, and I'd like you to cite it. Citations on our research project for this term are really important, and I want to make sure that everyone is comfortable citing it. So please take this moment and cite it in CSE format. Go ahead and pause the video. And then when you're done, I'll tell you how to do it. But please try it first. All right, CSE format is name year. So you start with the names. You do last name, comma, first initial for all of the authors. Then you put a period, and then you put the publication date. Here's the publication date. Then you put a period. Then you put the title. Here is the title. Then you put a period. Then you put the publisher information, the journal information. Here, it is PNAS. That's the Proceedings for National Academy of Sciences. You would click on that to figure out what it actually stands for. But there's my journal. How do I know this is the journal? It's wherever I find the volume and page number. So that's going to be located right by the journal name. And then you put where to find it. So you could put where to find it with this information right here, or the URL, or the DOI. So the URL goes to the web page that you found it on. But remember, there's lots of libraries that hold different articles. So when I originally found this, it was on PubMed. PubMed is just a library, it's not a journal. And so if I did the URL, it would say PubMed in there, but that's not just a link to the article itself, it's a link to the library. And so URLs end up being longer. That's totally fine. You can use a URL or you can use the DOI. The DOI is the digital object identifier. This goes directly to this paper. So it's like a URL for a scientific article. So scientific articles have their own DOIs. I always use the DOI because it's shorter and it's faster. And sometimes I mess up numbers like this when I try and rewrite them. So I just copy the DOI and put it in my citation. So name, date, title, publisher, where to find it. All right. I want you to practice what we've learned. Here's a picture of a silver fox. Go ahead and watch those videos I linked on Blackboard, and then see if you can explain how the silver fox experiment helps explain the current hypothesis on how dogs became domesticated. And does the domestication of dogs and foxes, what does it tell us about the overall process of evolution? This is a practice essay question. I hope that you do it. It's really important to try and synthesize the information in your brain, which is why I'm asking you to do it. And then for another practice experience, can you explain each of these lines of evidence and how they support the idea of evolution, the theory of evolution? We've got divergent and convergent evolution, the fossil record, homologous structures, biogeography, genetic similarities, and direct observation. So we've talked about a couple of those in the last lectures, the first one and this one, and hopefully you can synthesize that information and reiterate it in your own words. That's the goal with this. So we're practicing talking about what we're learning, because what we're learning is complex and has a lot of parts and a lot of vocab. I hope that was interesting. Have a great day. Email me if any questions, and we will talk soon. Bye.